Welcome to Recap King. In this video, we will explain Startup. This movie tells the story of a 19-year-old teenager who is so violent that he has been startup, moved to adult prison, where he finds his father in the prison who he hasn't seen since he was 5. His father then tries to get him to settle down, so he gets a chance to go through. Can his father make him to adapt in prison and become a better person? Let's find out in Startup. Startup begins by showing a 19-year-old youth named Eric Love, who is startup from a juvenile prison to a high-security adult prison, based on his age and his history of violent behavior, where his father, Neville, is serving a life sentence at that prison too. As usual, when entering the prison with the maximum security level, Eric had to undergo a series of very strict checks, before finally being escorted by a guard to his cell. Since this was the first time Eric was placed in an adult prison, the young man seemed frustrated and decided to assemble some of his belongings into a weapon for self-defense, because in any prison, no one would be able to guarantee his safety. Eric then hid his weapon in his cell's light box so the guards wouldn't see it. While waiting for lunch, Eric began to tidy up the room and do light exercise. While waiting in line to pick up his lunch, Eric got into a brief argument with a prisoner named Jago, who at that time was in charge of distributing food to the inmates. After getting his lunch rations, Eric went back to his room. After that, Eric joined the other inmates who had gathered in the prison grounds. There, Eric finally meets his father, Neville, who warns the young man not to cause trouble in prison and obey all the rules so that Eric can get out of there as soon as possible. However, Eric seemed to ignore his father's words and chose to return to his cell. Not long after, a prisoner named MacDonald visited Eric, but he assumed that MacDonald intended to hurt him, so Eric beat the man unconscious. After knowing that MacDonald didn't mean any harm, Eric rushed the man to the medical room. However, the attack was immediately noticed by the guards, who immediately took action to secure Eric. Because Eric is a young man who is quite tough and able to put up a fight, the guards had difficulty dealing with Eric, until finally, a man named Oliver, a volunteer prison therapist, came to save Eric and asked the guards to immediately take Eric to solitary confinement. Oliver then persuaded the warden and prison authorities to allow Eric to attend counseling sessions that were held regularly at the prison. After getting permission from the warden and other authorities, Oliver called Eric and tried to persuade him to join his counseling session. The authorities then explained the rules that Eric had to follow during the counseling session, and if the young man violated them, Eric would be immediately expelled from Oliver's therapy group and would never be allowed to attend counseling again. On the other hand, Neville, who is the right-hand man of the crime boss that runs the prison, Dennis, tries to ask for protection for his son. Dennis is willing to protect Eric as long as the young man doesn't cause trouble with the prisoners or the guards and obeys all prison regulations. After that, Neville visited Eric's cell personally. Neville then asked his son to learn to behave and follow the prison rules so he can get out. Neville warns Eric not to get into any trouble, especially with the guards, because if Eric does this, the warden will order the guards to kill Eric, disguise his death as a suicide, so that they will not be suspected by the prison council. Eric told his father that he would keep his attitude and obey his father's words, because actually, the young man wanted to go to prison because he only wanted to meet his father. But of course, Eric was just saying that so Neville wouldn't go on and on about everything. One day, Eric accidentally enters Jago's detention cell, which happens to be open, and Jago knows where he is. Eric then took Jago's lighter and gave it to MacDonald to prank the man. Sure enough, Jago immediately became furious and forced to search other prisoners' cells in order to find his favorite lighter. When Eric comes to Oliver's counseling session, the young man gets into trouble again, so the guards are forced to take Eric back to his holding cell. Realizing that Eric is still very young, his emotions are still very unstable, especially because Neville is in prison, so that Eric has lost a father figure in his life. Oliver also understands Eric's actions that often mess up and cause problems with other prisoners. Therefore, Oliver asked the prisoners who joined his counseling session to protect Eric from other prisoners and the guards. When 3 inmates are paid with drugs by Jago to dunk Eric in his toilet, one of Oliver's black group mates named Hassan steps in to save Eric as Oliver has requested. When Eric was about to fight back against his attackers, Hassan immediately stopped Eric and said that fighting back would only put Eric in an even more difficult position. Eric seemed to obey Hassan's words and chose to clean himself up. After that incident, Eric began to frequently attend counseling sessions held by Oliver and became friends with other prisoners who also attended the counseling sessions, most of whom were black people who have violent pasts, which they are trying to confront. The sessions often degrade into angry, posturing tirades by members against others, which Oliver de-escalates but uses to help them understand their rage. Eric begins to observe and also bond with the other group members. Knowing that Eric began frequenting Oliver's counseling sessions and became close friends with the black inmates, Neville was annoyed by his son fraternizing with black inmates. Neville said that he only asked Eric to attend Oliver's counseling sessions so that Eric learns to control his emotions, not to be close friends with the black inmates. When Eric attempts to explain his feelings to the uncomfortable Neville, Eric intuitions tells that his father is in a romantic relationship with his cellmate Ashley and is disgusted by it. The next day, Oliver is seen visiting Eric's detention cell and trying to be more close to the young man. The two of them had a brief conversation about their respective pasts and lives, before finally, Oliver and Eric headed to the counseling room to have a counseling session with the others. One day while Eric was taking a shower, he was attacked again by his fellow inmates. But Eric managed to strike back and force them to say who had sent them, who was none other than Jago. An angry Eric then took his homemade weapon and then paralyzed Jago. Eric then learns about the hierarchy in the prison, where the highest power is not in the hands of the warden, but in the hands of Dennis, the crime boss who is also a prisoner. When Eric tried to attack Dennis because of a misunderstanding, Neville immediately stopped him. Dennis then tells Jago not to bother Eric anymore because he is Neville's son. After that, Dennis asked Neville to come out, while the man tried to persuade Eric to join him. But Eric doesn't seem interested in Dennis' offer. The more diligently he took part in the counseling sessions, Eric was changing day by day for the better. The young man has begun to be able to control himself a little, and is open to other people. Eric even seemed calmer and more comfortable chatting with Oliver and his group members, and was seen smiling and laughing with them. One day, Neville, who had been observing Eric's progress while attending a counseling session, suddenly burst into the room where they were having a counseling session. The man then tried to provoke Eric by mentioning one of the most embarrassing things he had ever done. Hearing this, one of the group members made a joke that offended Eric, and Eric became furious. Oliver and a member of the group, Tyrone, tried to calm Eric down, but Tyrone instead clashed with them, because the man couldn't contain his emotions either. Tensions heat up when the group members start attacking each other, while Oliver is powerless to break them up. The commotion was finally noticed by Mrs. Cardew, one of the highest-ranking prison officials, who thinks Eric is the cause of the riots and tells Oliver that Eric will be kicked out of the counseling session because Eric has broken the agreement. Oliver tried to convince Mrs. Cardew to rethink her decision before expelling Eric because he has shown good progress during the counseling session. But Mrs. Cardew does not want to change her decision. After the chaos, Oliver seems to have a hard time controlling his anger and tries to attack the warden. Meanwhile, Eric, who was very angry and disappointed at his father for disrupting his counseling session, then vented his anger by beating his father. Neville didn't fight back, letting his son beat him until Eric was satisfied. Since Neville doesn't fight back, Eric thinks his father sees him as a loser and lets him win. As a result of the fight, Eric and Neville were then secured by the guards and taken to solitary confinement. After Eric and Neville were in solitary confinement, Dennis ordered the warden to execute Eric because he had attacked and belittled him. On the other hand, Neville, who managed to escape from solitary confinement, then went to Dennis to apologize for his son's behavior and begged Dennis to ensure Eric's safety. Dennis lies to Neville that he is going to protect Eric by telling Neville that he already considers Eric as his own family, and families should protect each other. While Neville is telling Dennis that he will not abide the death of his son, prison guards in the basement beat him and begin to hang Eric so it will look like suicide. But then, Dennis attacks Neville, trying to kill him. However, Neville is able to overpower him and stabilize him. Neville then rushed down to the basement to save his son who was being prepared to hang himself by the guards. Neville also had to fight the wardens and incapacitate them first before finally saving his son. Neville manages to defeat the guards and save Eric just in time, while the warden reports the incident to the prison board as an attempted suicide. Knowing that his father was trying so hard to save him, Eric was devastated and cried, because he had no idea that his fathers love him so much, and that everything Neville did was for his own safety and good. Eric, who was resting in the medical room to recover from his condition, received a visit from his group members who gave Eric support and encouraged the young man for what had just happened. Not long after, Eric returned to his detention cell and was approached by a prison warden who asked Eric to follow him. It turned out that that day, Neville would be transferred to another prison as a consequence of the reckless actions he had taken to save his son. As Neville is being transferred out, the guards allow father and son a tender moment. The film ends.